Alright, so I got a clip here for you guys that honestly almost gave me a full-on stroke when I watched it for the first time. So we have Marco Rubio sitting down here with CBS News Face the Nation, where he is going to describe to us how the United States military-industrial complex simply does not exist. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this real quick.
Well, I think there's two things. The first is the Chinese have found a way to use capitalism against us. And what I mean by that is the ability to attract investment into entities that are deeply linked to the state. That military commercial fusion that exists in China is a concept that we don't have in this country. We have contractors that do defense work, but there is no distinction in China between advancements in technology, biomedicine, whatever it might be, and the interests of the state.
Okay, so just amazing. Okay, first of all, on the fundamental first point that he was making in this short little clip that we got here, in terms of China actually like weaponizing capitalism against the United States and against the West broadly, that part of it is certainly true to some extent. I would say the most significant differentiating factor here between the United States and China in terms of this phenomenon that he's talking about here is that in China, you have a government apparatus that is firmly, to a large extent, in control over the private sector, and then in the United States, you have a private sector that is basically the complete reverse of that and is in almost complete and total control of our government. Okay, so this is what I would typically refer to as corruption. To Marco Rubio, I guess this phenomenon simply does not exist. Okay, so make no mistake about it, the point that he was making at the end of that clip seems to imply that he's trying to say that there is no real link in the same way that there is a link between the Chinese government and their military production, their defense industry, their weapons manufacturers. There is not that same link here in the United States between our weapons manufacturers, our defense contractors, the military industrial complex broadly, and the government. Okay, so a few counterpoints here, to say the least. I mean, this is just like honestly a laughable statement at face value here, even so much that, Michael Tracy over here on Twitter was able to point it out. But just a couple points here to make this, clear for everybody to see. Here from Business Insider, I've talked about this a number of different times on this channel. This is just one tiny aspect of how these weapons manufacturers, how these corporations have essentially bought off and control significant portions of the U.S. government and therefore get to dictate significant portions of U.S. foreign policy, which surprise, tends to be more on the hawkish side of that equation so that they can continue making profits by manufacturing these weapons and ammunitions that are used in warfare. Okay, so here from Business Insider, they say at least 15 lawmakers who shape, and it really should say directly shape, U.S. defense policy have investments in military contractors. So they say the politicians hold posts on either the House or Senate Armed Services panels. So in other words, the panels that essentially get to largely dictate what our military spending, what the Pentagon funding is actually going to look like. And they say they're investing their money in defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing, and potentially profiting off of oversight duties is indefensible, ethics watchdogs say. I mean, no shit. We have literal members who are sitting on the Armed Services Committee. Okay, these are supposed to be the watchdogs. These are supposed to be representatives of average working class Americans, and they are instead not only representing the interests of these defense contractors, these weapons manufacturers, but they are allowed legally somehow in this country to directly invest in the stock portfolios of these weapons manufacturers. Okay, so just a basic follow-up question here for everybody. What would make these stock portfolios, these stocks of these defense contractors go upwards and therefore return better investments to these lawmakers? What would make that happen? I don't know, maybe increased warfare, maybe increased aid packages, maybe increased, bloated budgets going towards the Pentagon. That is going to raise the stock portfolio of these defense contractors. So in other words, very basically here, we have members on the Armed Services Committees who have a direct personal financial stake in giving unlimited amounts in a complete slush fund to the Pentagon and therefore to these weapons manufacturers to profit from. Okay, and just as a reminder, the Pentagon is an organization that has not passed an audit 5 times in a row. Okay, I covered this a couple weeks ago on this channel. 5 audits in a row, the Pentagon has failed. They cannot account for massive swaths of their budget. Okay, so while you have all of these conservatives and even Democrats, some, sometimes like Joe Manchin and stuff, who constantly push forward with this idea that, we need a balanced budget, we need to, cut the debt and the deficit and all of that. Somehow this military spending, this military slush fund, this wasteful, bloated organization is never brought up in that conversation. And meanwhile, you kind of get a little bit of a glimpse in terms of why that may be. But Another aspect of this, okay, so here from Open Secrets, they say defense contractors spent $101 million on lobbying during the first 3 quarters of 2022. So do you see what kind of money is being sent from these private for-profit defense contractors into government coffers, okay, into the campaigns of a lot of these politicians who then get to decide how they are going to dole out handouts or, profits to these very same defense contractors, okay? Over $101 million in just lobbying spending during the first 3 quarters of 2022, okay? So these are very powerful industries that have huge sway over the Pentagon budget and over U.S. foreign policy. Here again, just to get a little bit more specific here with a anecdotal example from the Biden administration. They say here from The Hill, Biden Pentagon pick, this guy Lloyd Austin could make up to $1.7 million from leaving Raytheon. Okay, so if you're keeping tally so far, we have members on the Armed Services Committee who, honestly, no members of Congress, if we're being real about it, should be allowed to hold any stocks whatsoever, because then there is a perverse incentive for them to act on behalf of their own stock portfolios or on behalf of the stock market in general, which is vastly disproportionately owned by the very wealthy in this country. That shouldn't even be allowed at a baseline levels. You should ban the ability for Congress members to trade stock, point blank period whatsoever. But specifically, we have number one, members on the Armed Services Committee who are trading and profiting off of war stocks, essentially. We also have the defense sector that is spending tens of millions of dollars on an annual basis in order to lobby the government for their foreign policy objectives and therefore for increased warfare and hawkish foreign policy objectives on that front. And then number three, we also have the revolving door of the military-industrial complex, if you will, where we have specific examples here, like with Biden's Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, who got a $1.7 million payout as he was leaving Raytheon. Raytheon being a top weapons manufacturer, that was one of the first companies that got a multi-billion-dollar contract from the Biden administration once Lloyd Austin took this position. Okay, so even the idea that you would have somebody like Lloyd Austin, who, I'm sure many people within the military probably have a lot of respect for this guy, right? But the idea that you have a guy like Lloyd Austin who can go from being a top U.S. general to going and working for a for-profit weapons manufacturing firm like Raytheon that explicitly exists to profit off of increased warfare and suffering and death overseas, okay, and imperialism from the United States of America. This guy leaves his post within the military, goes and works for a private corporation, and then is able to go back into a top key government position, this time leading the Pentagon, okay, after he just got a $1.7 million payout after leaving the board of Raytheon. I mean, it's a complete fucking joke to even suggest for a second that we do not have this intimate, interlinking connection between the military-industrial complex and our government. Again, the main difference here, the main distinction here is that our military-industrial complex, these for-profit corporations in the defense industry and across the entire American economy, have more sway over the government than the government has over these private corporations. In China, it's the reverse of that, right? So going back to Marco Rubio's criticism here, specifically on Marco Rubio, let's just check in with, where little Rubio is getting some of his money. So here from The Intercept, some great reporting from Li Fong. He says, Marco Rubio, following donor dollars, frequently veers from limited government dogma. Okay, so what is he talking about here? He says Republican presidential candidate, so this is back from when he was running for president in 2016, Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio casts himself as a champion of limited government and in a new campaign ad even depicts himself as a warrior against special interests. Marco Rubio, a warrior against special interests. I mean, it's just amazing how these guys will, portray themselves. But they say on issues including sugar subsidies, online gambling, spending on military contractors, we're going to focus in on that one here, but these other ones are not anything to gloss over as well, telecom regulations and taxpayer support to scandal-plagued for-profit colleges, Rubio has backed a sweeping and costly rule for the federal government. So again, I'll link this down below if you want to go read through this entire piece. It's a great piece, but we're just going to focus here on military spending. So they say Rubio is campaigning on a pledge to hike military spending by $1 trillion over the next 10 years. I must have missed this back in the campaign days. I mean, maybe I was in high school, I wasn't paying as close of attention to it, but $1 trillion over the next 10 years. We're already spending $1 trillion per year, damn near just on our military already. Okay, he wants to increase it by $1 trillion over the next 10 years, and similarly promises to exert more military muscle abroad. So basically, imperialism, warfare, etc. Fundraising records show that Rubio raises cash regularly at events hosted by lobbyists for the largest defense contractors in America, including Boeing, General Dynamics, and Honeywell. And in addition, as we've previously reported, several of Rubio's foreign policy and defense advisors simultaneously consult for military contractors. He has people who are working advising him who are also at the same fucking time advising military weapons manufacturers. I mean, you cannot make this shit up. They finish off here saying that the US already spends more on military than the next 7 nations combined, including Russia and China, who of course he was trying to give his little hawkish pushback there too. So here, as a recap here in terms of what he was just saying there on how much the US military is spending right now compared to other comparable nations here from PGPF, they say US defense spending compared to other countries. Okay, so here we have it. $801 billion from the United States, and this is an undercount. We've already been raising it much far beyond that. From my calculations, at least, it's getting up closer to $900 billion at this point than $800 billion. But even taking it at this low estimate here, okay, so you could add up literally China, India, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and South Korea. Most of those countries are our allies, and still you would not reach the level of military spending that the United States is currently conducting. And on top of that, that doesn't even get into the discussion of the over 900 military bases that we have stationed across the world, including basically surrounding the entirety of China on the Pacific Ocean coast. So, I mean, there are many different things that you could say about U.S. military spending, and one of them would not be that they are somehow totally independent and neutral arbiters of military spending when compared to the military-industrial complex. Okay, again, you could make critiques of how, China's military-industrial complex works over there, or whatever shiny new weapon that American politicians want you to be terrified of or something like that. But at the end of the day, the basic fundamental lesson here is that the US military industrial complex has more power over our foreign policy agenda than any single politician in this country. Okay, this is an entire industry that has been warned about for decades in this country, going back all the way to Eisenhower in the 50s, who was warning about the military industrial complex and the potential influence of essentially for-profit war profiteering. And so, I mean, we've known about this for a long time. The military-industrial complex is no secret to anybody who watches my channel. We are talking about a basically $1 trillion per year agency that cannot pass an audit, that is essentially profiting to the tune of billions of dollars a year for each of these corporations that we're talking about here, off of increased bloodshed, increased warfare, increased suffering for the global population and for the American people, for that matter. If you want to just focus on the domestic aspect of this, how much money we're dumping into the Pentagon, where we could be funding basic social services for the American people, but somehow we never have enough money for Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or any other child care programs or education programs or other healthcare programs as well. Never have enough money for that. Infinite money for the military budget, and it's because we have politicians like Marco Rubio, but also many other Democrats, many other Republicans, and independents for that matter, who basically want to pretend as if this type of corruption doesn't exist, or as if it's somehow so normal that we should just look over it, when it is completely not normal. Okay, we should not have politicians having the ability to trade in stocks whatsoever, especially not if you are sitting on the Armed Services Committee and you are investing in weapons manufacturers who you are giving out contracts to. But on top of that, we need to dramatically slash the military spending, and we need to potentially end the prospects of a future, World War III with China, which I'm sure that many hawkish neocons like Marco Rubio would be very happy for us to go down that path.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying